Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today, coming indoors on such a beautiful autumnal day. But obviously, as I was kidding my good friend and colleague here, you're attracted by one of two names, or perhaps both, Leonardo da Vinci and or Gary Radke. But anyway, I'm Philip Verri, the Chief Operating Officer here at the High Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the public program, first public program, which launches the exhibition Leonardo da Vinci, Hand of the Genius. And I have to say, we've been pinching ourselves all week. It's very rare indeed for a museum director or the COO to come up and say, welcome to a major exhibition on Leonardo da Vinci. It simply does not happen that often. When you think about Leonardo da Vinci in the United States, there's one painting at the National Gallery, a handful of drawings scattered about in public collections. But on the occasion of this exhibition, we have 24 drawings by the Renaissance master. We have 4 sculptures, and you'll learn a lot more about those sculptures today in Gary's talk, as well as a premier selection of sculpture by Renaissance masters, including Donatello, Verrocchio, and Rustici, a name you'll become more familiar with both during the lecture and once you get to see the exhibition. So we truly do have to pinch ourselves in gratitude and appreciation for bringing this great exhibition to the High Museum, to Atlanta, and to the Southeast. So Leonardo da Vinci, Hand of the Genius, is organized by the High Museum of Art in association with the J. Paul Getty Museum of Los Angeles and in collaboration with the Opera di Santa Maria del Fiore and the Opificio delle Pietre Dure, both in Florence, Italy. The exhibition, a modified version of the exhibition, will travel to the Getty in March 2010. So Gary Radke, who's become a great friend, travel companion over the last several years. Many of you have met Gary over the last 8 years in his role as the consulting curator for Italian art. And during that time, he has mounted 4 major exhibitions on Italian Renaissance art. And they include sort of the usual names, really, Michelangelo, Verrocchio, Ghiberti, and now Leonardo da Vinci. And when everyone asks what's next, well, there will be a what's next, and we're working on it. So we look forward to sharing some ideas with you down the road. But Gary is also the Dean's Professor of Humanities at Syracuse University, where he has taught for 30 years. He has garnished many awards there. He's a well-beloved professor both in Syracuse and in Florence, where Syracuse has an important Italian program. And we are simply delighted to welcome him and welcome him back to today's topic on what should a sculpture by Leonardo da Vinci look like. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Gary Radke.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to have Leonardo with us, both in spirit and in actual material form, and for me to share with you in a certain way my thinking about how I've made some decisions, how my scholarly colleagues and I do our work when we go about the business of deciding what to, in this case, include in our roster of what sculpture by Leonardo da Vinci might have looked like. I hope that this lecture in the end, besides giving you some insights into some works that I included in the exhibitions and some works that I rejected for inclusion in this exhibition, that it will give you insights into how art historians think. How is it that we go about our business? What is it and how is it possible that we take works of art that are 500 years old and we still see new things in them, that we learn about them, that we can make arguments and that we can make some kinds of decisions about them? Now, I know I have a very sophisticated audience this afternoon. I'm very grateful for that. But I want to remind you that most people think that what art historians do is more like this. We are snobs. We drink wine. We read Winnie the Pooh and find great philosophical meaning in it. We basically are people who are somehow engaged in the world of ideas, not in the way that we think of it as being important, but as being out there a bit sort of in some other distant planet or universe. But well, we may occasionally come across as snobs because we do make decisions. We make value judgments. We decide that we think one thing may be superior to the other in other things. What we really are, art historians, I would claim, are detectives. We are Sherlock Holmes there, and we provided you, in fact, with the opportunity in our exhibition to join us in this search, because at the opening of our exhibition, as many of you know, have been in the galleries already, we have magnifying lenses so that you, like Sherlock Holmes on the right, or like Bernard Berenson, the great American-Italian connoisseur on the left, can look closely at works of art and see whether you can see what the artist has fully left for us to appreciate. Besides being detectives and snobs, we also have to be prosecutors, because we need to ask our subjects hard questions, and we need to make, I hope, compelling, concluding arguments. And so what I'm going to be doing today, in a sense, is a bit of Perry Mason, a bit of sort of laying out the evidence, leading you through it, and hopefully having you, the members of the jury, agree with me at the end that I may have found 2 new sculptures by Leonardo, and that we also have some works, other works surviving that give us a good sense of what Leonardo himself did intend to create, did in fact create during his 67-year-long life. Now, the reason I'm talking to you about this and that we've organized this exhibition is that in the past, not many people have actually paid attention to this particular aspect of Leonardo's work. Part of the problem has to do with our prime suspect, Mr. da Vinci himself. Leonardo was, as you know, a multi-talented artist, an artist who kept thousands of pages. We have surviving 7,000 pages of notes from observations of the world, of mechanics, of engineering, of flight, of things that were in fact unimagined by others of his contemporaries. And he also had very nasty things to say about sculpture. He wrote a treatise on painting. And in that treatise on painting, he said, painting is superior to all the other arts. Sculpture is the work of dirty craftsmen. It is a kind of activity that is physical and sweaty and messy. It is the kind of activity where the sculptor goes into his studio and there's raucous noise and there's dust flying, and when it's all over, the sculptor looks like little more than a baker covered in white, messy flour. Now, why did Leonardo say that? He said it in one reason, because in fact his vision of sculpture was not necessarily what we associate with sculpture, and that is the kind of sculpture he was just denigrating in those remarks I've summarized for you. For Leonardo, sculpture was modeling. It was not taking a big, heavy block of stone and taking a chisel and going at it. It was taking clay. It was taking wax. It was perhaps taking silver and other materials, plaster, and modeling them, shaping them with his hands in 3 dimensions, and then perhaps casting them into other materials. The other reason that he was so, frankly, nasty about the kind of sculpture he talked about was there was this young man. He was 23 years old, younger than Leonardo. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti. And Michelangelo and Leonardo could not have been more different one from the other. Michelangelo was actually an aristocrat, but played the role of being a down and dirty workman who went into his studio and carved away every day and didn't care what he looked like, but then made a fortune and invested it in real estate and kept his family comfortable for generations afterwards. Leonardo, on the other hand, was an illegitimate love child, a young man who grew up in the country with his parents, grandparents rather, not formally tutored, a man who I think had some social pretensions, a man who we have reports dressed in fine velvets, always wore stylish clothes, could sing, could dance, could play the lute, recited poetry. And for him, the idea of sculpture then was one that had to be one that was more malleable rather than the physical brute work. And it was a way for him to distinguish himself from that young upstart, Michelangelo. But if we had looked more closely at the evidence, if we had called in some witnesses in 15th century Florence, I think we would quickly have learned that Leonardo himself was, in fact, among the most famous sculptors of the Renaissance. The first witness we would have called would be my PowerPoint. There we go. Would have been his teacher, Andrea del Verrocchio. Andrea del Verrocchio was the consummate artist, mentor, teacher for Leonardo. He worked in all the media that Leonardo worked. He was well-versed in the classics as well as literature. And while Leonardo was in that shop for at least 15 years, and perhaps even longer, Verrocchio was involved with some of the most important and various sculptural possibilities and commissions that we can imagine. Here are just a few of the surviving works in marble, in clay, in bronze, in silver, works that would have, in fact, were part of Leonardo's education. So he was trained to be a sculptor as well as a painter, and so we have that evidence. We also have in our show a lovely little drawing from Windsor with all these marvelous sort of sketches and thoughts and ideas that's so typical of Leonardo, where we have graphic written evidence that Leonardo did engage in this kind of work. And in that rectangle at the bottom, I've highlighted that notation to himself: make a small one of this in wax, 1 finger long. We know that that for Leonardo, sketching meant both doing things in 2 dimensions on paper and other materials, as well as making small models and working with them for his paintings as well as his sculptures, because his paintings are famous because they're so sculpturally rich. They're so volumetric. They're so 3-dimensionally complicated that frequently he had to make sculptures of his own in order to make those paintings work, and for him to be able to study the shadows, the light, the different forms and interactions. We also have another drawing in our show that shows clearly that Leonardo knew Michelangelo's work. In fact, he sketches Michelangelo's David on this sheet, transforming it with some black chalk sketches at the bottom into perhaps a Neptune figure. And if we look at the historical record, we find that, in fact, Leonardo sat on the committee that decided where Michelangelo's David was to be placed. You may recall that Michelangelo was given a huge block of stone for a prophet figure that was initially intended for one of the buttresses of Florence Cathedral. But either as Michelangelo was working, or certainly by the time he had finished this enormous masterpiece, it was decided that it was too important to stick way up high on the cathedral. And so they gathered a citizen committee, and Leonardo, among others, was asked where to place it. Now, to me, it's quite interesting what Leonardo said, because the majority opinion, which prevailed, was to follow the artist, that is, Michelangelo's idea, that the sculpture be put in front of the city hall, in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, to stand there as a kind of sentinel of political strength and of vigilance against the enemies. Leonardo said, oh no, we don't want to have it there. We want it in the shadows over here in this loggia to the other side. Now, you got the idea here. I think there is a bit of marginalization going on there, that Leonardo sees what might be going on with Michelangelo. But it also reveals, I think, again, Leonardo's different understanding of sculpture. For Michelangelo, sculpture was this big, solid thing. For Leonardo, so often it was atmospheric effects. It was soft forms that, in fact, could be better appreciated in a loggia, in a covered space, the kind of space he tells us to paint portraits in. He said we can imagine that he probably painted the Mona Lisa, asking her to sit in a courtyard or in a loggia. He recommends not to put your subjects in direct light, but to put them in the light that is a reflective light. To then have a musician playing so that the person who is being portrayed will be calm and will be happy, and the artist will be as well. So that relationship may have been one that reveals as much about Leonardo as it does about Michelangelo. We also, of course, should have known that we should do an exhibition about Leonardo and sculpture, because he did create one of the great unfortunately lost, but one of the great sculptures of the Italian Renaissance. And that was his equestrian monument for the Francesco Sforza that we've recreated in our piazza. And I'm just briefly showing you these drawings just to get you to look at them again when you go into the galleries or go back to the galleries, remembering that studies like the one on the right from Windsor are at the basis of this recreation, which has been displayed elsewhere in Europe and in California and is now galloped up the highway, Route 16, and others to get to us here in Atlanta. But one of the things that many people forget about this Sforza horse project, which occupied him for 17 years and was an obsession, was that obsession continued the rest of his life. Even while he was telling people that he really thought painting was the best of all things, he went and did other studies, which are documented in our exhibition, documented equestrian monument for the Lord of Milan, Gian Giacomo Trivulzio, which he made in the early 16th century, even designs on the right-hand side for the King of France when he became the royal painter for the King of France in the last 2 years of his life. So sculpture was intimately part of his work. We also have little sketches here and there that show us that Leonardo's conception of sculpture was actually pretty broad in terms of its range. Besides figural sculpture, besides great equestrian monuments, he designed and sketched little things that look like either candlesticks, like the one produced by his teacher Andrea del Verrocchio, or others that were transformed into little fountains and other kinds of tableware and decorative tableware that we have an example of in our exhibition. Leonardo also, as you can imagine, thinking about who Leonardo was a man who thought about putting sculpture in action. A man who invented and did little drawings of figures like this one, which would have been a water clock that would have moved and had this figure, who would have been sculptural and physical, actually beating the bell as the hours passed. Leonardo was, in fact, a famous maker of mobile sculpture. Recently, a team in Italy recreated one of these. It's a lot uglier than Leonardo would have made, but it's fine. It was a great mechanical lion, and this lion was designed by Leonardo as a sculpture of an actual lion, but that was mobile, that had a machine inside of it, so that when it would walk, when the King of France came to visit, it would walk towards the king and then open its chest, and lilies, the famous fleur de lis, would fall out on the ground in honor of the king. Leonardo also had a very famous sculpture that he made in his studio at the Vatican. That sculpture was of a dragon, and the dragon sat quietly in the corner of his studio when you came to visit him. And then Leonardo, I don't know what he would do, whether he would ring a bell or nod his head or something, but his assistants would go in the nearby room, and they would start up the bellows. And they would start blowing air into this dragon. And this dragon would enlarge and enlarge and enlarge until it was like one of those great balloons for Macy's parade on Thanksgiving Day, and literally drive people out of his studio. It was a playful kind of sculpture, but a sculpture where Leonardo took advantage of three-dimensionality, of form, and of interaction with his audiences. But I suppose if most people were trying to imagine what should a sculpture by Leonardo da Vinci look like, maybe the first thing that would come to mind was, well, maybe something like the Mona Lisa, right? I mean, this is a famous painting. And in fact, there is a sculpture in the Berlin museums that has sometimes been associated with Leonardo that I'd like to talk to you briefly about. It is a life-size sculpture in wax. It's lost its lower arms, but it's sort of Leonardesque. It's got this charming tilt of the head. It's got this sweet little expression on it. We have to imagine that it might originally have been painted, so the eyes, which are now blank, might have been there. And for a while, in fact, this was the most famous sculpture by Leonardo in Western Europe in the 1890s. A problem arose, however. And that is that it soon became discovered around the year 1900 that the sculpture was awfully closely related to a painting in England that we now know is not by Leonardo, and that was only vaguely related to it. And then a gentleman came forward and said, "My dad made it." And, in fact, it was traced back to the 1830s, and it was an evocation. It is a response to Leonardo-type forms. It, therefore, gets an X. But Leonardo is reported to, and we have evidence in our exhibition, to have created a variety of sculptural types. He created in stucco and in plaster, according to Vasari and some others, lovely images of smiling women and of laughing children. And so we put in the exhibition one of the classic examples from the 1460s of that marble bust of a little boy, and a drawing that's in color on the far right, where we see Leonardo studying this same type, truncating the figure at its biceps, studying it both from the front and the back. Evidence that if you hadn't thought about sculpture, you would think, well, gee, he's just sort of cutting this figure off a little funny, but that actually inserts and shows him studying this kind of work. With that evidence in mind, I just pulled my water over, but I had the cap on. This is good. With this evidence in mind, that Leonardo, there's written records that Leonardo created sculptures of young children and of women, that there's these drawings that we have in our exhibition. I was fascinated when I was asked to go to Switzerland to see this terracotta bust that has been identified as possibly Christ as a youth. And I had a graduate student work on it, and looking at photographs, I was quite taken with the possibility that it has these downcast eyes. It has a kind of psychological richness that we don't normally see in these otherwise pretty but slightly non-emotional kinds of representations of children or of others. So I went and looked at it, and then I started comparing it to other works by Leonardo. Here, initially, we've had the same general sort of form of the nose, of those sweet little lips, slightly parted, like in the Angel of the Annunciation that's in the Uffizi. But then I began to look at the hair. And Leonardo's hair is always alive. It always has a physical presence. And this hair looks like he's having a bad hair day. It's a bit sort of falling down, and it's rather droopy. In fact, especially compared to, say, even the kind of hair that his teacher, the great Andrea del Verrocchio, was able to do in his David. But I remained sort of interested in this piece because, of course, this is a clay model. It's a terracotta sketch, so we shouldn't expect that it has everything that we might see in a finished work. But I began to compare some more and felt that, no, the hair was getting limper. It was falling even further down. And then, having the opportunity to see it in person, I really became rather disillusioned. Here are some views in the warehouse where it's stored in Switzerland. And this poor young man has gone prematurely bald. The top of his head is completely there. Really, it's like icing on a cake, these curls, and that's why they don't look right. It doesn't look like hair. Leonardo, if he had made this work, might surely have sketched it very quickly, but in all of his works, you have a sense that he understands what's missing from his drawing, even if he hasn't put it in. I also was very disturbed in seeing the work in person that had no ears. Leonardo is a person who believes in the integrity of the human body. He's a person who looks at works, and if he would not have modeled the ear perfectly, there would have been something there. There's plenty of room for the ears. There's plenty of rooms for other things. And some colleagues as well said to me, well, Gary, we've been looking around, and we think that the general type, in fact, could be understandable as perhaps a piece from the 1470s or 1480s by the Circle of Antonio Rossellino. I agreed, and therefore got an X. Now, there was a work that I was about to give an X that's in the exhibition. Because one of the things the art historian does, of course, is start with photographs, start with reproductions, but it's always the original work of art that has to be seen in person in order to appreciate what's really going on. So Philip and I had the good fortune of going to Budapest. where this actually rather famous little horse and rider is located, and which we decided to put in our exhibition. It is a bronze work that is probably a bronze of a model, of something made in another medium, because it's not very finished. It doesn't have as much detail as we expect from an artist like Leonardo and others, but it has an energy. It has a movement. It is really quite extraordinary, and it relates very well to a series of other studies by Leonardo. For example, in our exhibition, we have this encounter between a horseman on horseback and a dragon, and this leaping form that Leonardo had tried to put into his Sforza monument there is one of his ideas as well. When we look at the figure from front and back, we see it moving and turning. Leonardo never content for something to just be stolid and fixed in place, but we almost always feel something either cinematic or caught in time and space as though we're seeing it in stop action. Now, there was one concern I had, and it was this sort of Godzilla look of the horse when you look at it from up front. But then I began to actually think about it. And although it's not particularly attractive, this view, it's first of all not the view that the artist would have thought of as the primary view, so it's not where we're supposed to see the work. But it actually makes a lot of sense. Whoever modeled the model that's behind this bronze understood that if you were going to make a rearing horse, you couldn't just have it politely have its two back hoofs just next to one another. That you had to get a broader base of support. And some of that awkwardness is, in fact, to me, a sign of the intelligence of an artist who, like Leonardo, was thinking about these forms. Here are some sketches of some later designs for horses, either for paintings or for sculptures, where we begin to see that sort of big rump in the back and some spreading of the legs. But then there was the tail. Art historians are obsessive. We look at every detail. We want to make sure that it all goes together. And so I started collecting examples of tails of horses in Leonardo's drawings. And they're quite distinctive. Leonardo's tails, because, as I told you, his sculptures, his works of art are always full of energy. They always rise up slightly. He doesn't just let the tail just be flat or something else or out. But this thing that's on here is this weird sort of, it looks like a thumb, like it's just been created with a thumb and attached in there. And I wasn't sure whether that didn't sort of say to me, no, this can't be Leonardo. And then I noticed something else that you can barely see probably where you're sitting, but that I'll mark right here. There is a seam around that tail. That tail seems to have been added later from what may have been a partial model that survived in Leonardo's studio. I also wasn't sure about the rider. The rider is very expressive, and he would seem to be, he's certainly holding on, trying to respond to this horse, but he's a little peculiar anatomically, and he's certainly peculiar in terms of the action in which he's engaged. All of Leonardo's horsemen, when they start rearing, they purposely put their... Is that backward? I can't tell from where. No, the horse goes around like this, right? Okay. They always put their legs back to hold them on. This guy thinks that he can hold onto this horse even his legs forward. So we had this work analyzed. We looked at the bronze alloy and others, and in the end, I and some colleagues at the National Gallery in Washington came to the conclusion that the figure and the tail are later additions to what was remaining of Leonardo's composition. So we've got that much. We're getting better, right? I mean, we're not crossing it all out. We're at least there, and we're getting pretty close. There are some works, though, as you know, in our exhibition and in the catalog that I think are even closer to Leonardo, and that's where we're headed. We have a pair of terracotta plates. One on the left by Andrea del Verrocchio, very clearly associated with his work, and I'll demonstrate that to you visually. And that one that's been attributed to Leonardo, and that the more I've seen it here, actually, I'm getting warmer and warmer about, as I said, seeing it in person. Now, when you make an attribution to an artist, like a good defense or prosecutor, you can't just say, well, it's got to be by this person because it's related to that person. You also have to show that it can't be by somebody else. You have to sort of exclude certain other not alibis, but other people who might be there as possible perpetrators of your act that you're trying to prosecute. So let me first follow up on why this figure on the left for these pair of angels is most likely, very clearly, by Andrea del Verrocchio. Here on the right-hand side is a sketch model that is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it has a similar kind of flying drapery. It even has these nice little, oh, there's the drapery. Okay, let's go back there. Drapery and little clouds under the feet. And certainly this rich and rather heavy fabric is what we see in some of Verrocchio's finished sculptures in bronze, which themselves would have been modeled in clay or in wax. As I said, the angel is sort of moving along on nice little, very substantial clumps of cloud. We see that in Verrocchio's sketch model. We also see our angel holding on physically, absolutely palpably, to a cloud here. Verrocchio's approach to realism is very clear-eyed. It is very insistent on reporting what he sees. He's not going to make even an angel truly otherworldly. He's going to make sure that everything is substantial and rooted to the ground. And I think we see that here. The hair is typical Verrocchio hair, these wonderful curls and really rich forms of coiffure. But this angel on the right, while looking so similar, it is one of probably must have been at least 6 of them, has some other characteristics that actually diverge from that Verrocchio form, even while obviously it shares common traits. The head. The face in particular. Whether you like Verrocchio better or Leonardo better is not the point here. The point is that these are actually works that are by 2 different kinds of artists. One who is much more straightforward, the artist on the right, who I believe now is probably Leonardo, in a sense much more poetic. Those tight curls around the head, the way that light catches around them, and the fine detail can be related to portraits, for example, that Leonardo did. The portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, for example, that's in the National Gallery in Washington. The clouds are also quite different. They seem to be more drawn. They seem to be more atmospheric. It's as though, although Leonardo is a sculptor, he also wants to get some of the effects of painting by doing just little incisions here and there and making them more a kind of vision, more a kind of atmospheric effect. His drapery comes right out of Verrocchio's drapery, but it's even more complex, it's even more seriously studied, and it ends up being even more in believable motion. And those wings, which look so beautifully realistic on the Verrocchio, become even more realistic in this figure on the right, where they overlap rather than being plastered flat against the background, where they now seem to be caught in some motion, in that time-lapse sort of sensibility that is so Leonardo. Now, we can make those observations, but then we have to tie them and see whether we find these characteristics in Leonardo's work. Here we have 2 details from a painting by Andrea del Verrocchio, Leonardo's teacher, where most people now agree there is also some assistance of Leonardo. They both did sleeves. As you can see, they're both remarkably rendered on a very small panel. As is typical of Verrocchio, on the left-hand side, it is serious. We feel like we see the individual threads, and it's there. Leonardo gives us the individual threads, but also, in addition, the atmospheric effect, the glittering on the edges of that velvet so that it feels even more as though it's actually there. There's a crucial difference, in fact, in the way that the sleeves themselves are tied together. In the Verrocchio, he figures, okay, there's going to be a little tie there. We'll just put 2 blue slashes. We'll just paint 2 blue lines, and that'll indicate it's there. Leonardo observes that the slash sleeve bunches where the blue ribbon comes. It then expands slightly. It then contracts again on the second blue ribbon, and then it expands again. This kind of level of observation, and then this sort of surrounding it into a beautiful form is so Leonardo. This sense of movement that we have in the fluttering ribbons and in the draperies here are characteristic of Leonardo drawings that are not even of angelic subjects. This great warrior in the British Museum, for example, there are ribbons behind his helmet and a sash tied around his sleeve where Leonardo can't allow that to just stay still. Even the fringe at the bottom as well slightly moves, slightly goes into proportion and into some kind of form. So we get to our angel, and it gets, from me at least, a question mark. It's a question mark that's awfully close to Leonardo. And as I said, I put this together before actually the whole exhibition was up. I might even remove that question mark now. To me, it strikes me as an ambitious young work. In some ways, it's too busy. In some ways, there's too many things going on in it. But that's just the point, that if you were a young artist trying out some new ideas, this is the kind of work you might do. Now, the work that I want to spend the rest of the lecture discussing for you and to help you to see how we do our work as art historians is this relief of the beheading of John the Baptist that's in our exhibition that was dreadfully tarnished because it's silver, but that has been cleaned for our exhibition and that allowed an in-depth and direct study of a work that was justly famous, paid for or commissioned from Andrea del Verrocchio, Leonardo's teacher, and actually the payments are clear to that firm, but that we really didn't know as well as we might. Here, for those of you who haven't yet seen it in person, the transformation. And this is, in fact, a shot that's purposely taken without any of the wonderful glow and glitter and reflections that you get on the silver, but one that shows that there's a lot more detail here than we ever imagined. In fact, as I said to you, people wonder, well, how do you study works of art that are 500 years old? How do you find out new things? Well, one of the things is you give them a bath. You clean them up. You find out where is the dirt and where is the stuff that was originally there. And when you've done that, new things begin to appear. One of the things that appeared, and this is a slide picture taken during the restoration when 2 of the figures were not yet restored and others had been cleaned, appeared clearly was that these figures, which we had forgotten, some earlier art historians knew this but had been forgotten, were all individually made, hand-hammered out of silver and inserted onto the background of this relief. This was a revelation both in terms of a good semi-industrialized process that would have allowed Verrocchio perhaps to subcontract some of the work to assistants. It also allowed us to pick these things up, to turn them around, to look at them, to see the individual pieces more closely than we might have. Now, in the exhibition, we purposely have tried to make it somewhat simpler by just offering the evidence of why the figure on the far left and the figure that's not restored yet, standing with his back to us on the second from the right here, is by Leonardo. But in this lecture, I'd like to show you why I think we can very seriously say everything else is by Verrocchio. So we can give the rest of the relief to Verrocchio. And if we do that, then I believe that the 2 figures that are so much like Leonardo have to be by Leonardo because they're so different than Verrocchio. So first Verrocchio, see how that works, and then we'll get to Leonardo. Here are the parts of the relief that are quite clearly, I think, by Verrocchio. The subject is the beheading of the Baptist, and we see him kneeling on the ground in the foreground, the very center of the relief, this executioner, and then some onlookers or some people who are typical in Renaissance paintings and in Renaissance sculptures for enlivening and enhancing the composition. I'm going to show you in a moment why these are by Verrocchio. But even if I didn't have the time to give you the detailed comparisons, we would just think about, well, if you were making this relief and you're putting Andrea del Verrocchio Incorporated as a signature on this work, which he did, which figures are you most likely to have spent some time doing? The central figures, the actual subject, the beheading of the Baptist himself and the executioner, and then figures to the sides might be those which either you might do yourself or that you might subcontract out to others. Now here is the kneeling Baptist, and those of you who've seen it know it's only about 4.5 inches high. I mean, these are tiny figures, and I want to emphasize that while I'm distinguishing between Leonardo and Verrocchio, I am not in any way denigrating Verrocchio. Verrocchio is a masterful artist, but with a different aesthetic. An artist who, as we see here, has in marble and bronze, does the same kind of tight corkscrews of hair that can work at a monumental scale or can work at this miniature scale and give us those same things. The same high cheekbones, the same heavy-lidded eyes, the same sense of tight structure underlying that head. This is, in fact, a typical Verrocchio detail. Look at that arm. We seem to see every sinew under the skin. In fact, if anything, it almost looks a bit flayed. It looks as though the skin has been taken off, and now we're down to that next level where we see the blood vessels and the bone and the structure. It's a very similar thing to what Verrocchio does here in his famous painting of the Baptist for the Uffizi, where this hand seems so extraordinarily bony. In fact, some contemporaries criticized Verrocchio because they said his figures looked like the skin had been taken off them. He was so insistent in getting those details right. Art historians look for tiny details, details that we call Morellian details because in the late 19th century, one Giovanni Morelli, for Morellian, said that maybe one of the places that you look when you want to know is a work really by an artist, look in places that are not the most obvious. Look, for example, here, the way that these folds, whether he's carving in marble or working in silver, have this little loop at the end of them, that it has this detail that is not necessarily peculiar to drapery itself, but is peculiar to Verrocchio. So that a further confirming detail. We also can compare figure types, facial types. A warrior on the far right of our relief, just magnificent Verrocchio. It is so powerful. It's as though we are there at this screeching moment when Verrocchio himself has taken his stylus while he's modeling this silver and drawn around the eyes and stretched the skin so tight that we just feel all that tension and all that energy. And it's very similar to other works that come from Verrocchio's workshop, and they're characteristically like this, these particular physiognomic types. The executioner is somewhat different in that he is modeled on both front and back, but even there, this seems very much Verrocchio because the musculature initially looks very realistic, and then you go, feel your back. Do I really have those kinds of muscles like that? Does it really come down in just these kinds of stringy ways? No, it doesn't, and neither does the front. This is an artist who is giving you enough reality, and Verrocchio is a great realist, but enough reality for you to feel that you've seen it, but not so much that you're actually lost and moved into another world the way Leonardo does. So I think we can with some confidence say that the figures I've been showing you, as well as two little ones in the background, these meet all the criteria. They fit very comfortably into what we expect from Verrocchio. But there are two other figures in this relief, the dancing young man on the left and the figure on the right, that share some characteristics between them two that don't appear in the others. Here they are close up. tallest on the left is 9 inches tall, and yet it's still full of intriguing detail. And what's particularly interesting when we were able to pick them up and hold them in our hands and turn them over is that the backs of these figures are very different than the other ones. Here we see that, of course, the back of the figure is not finished because these are stuck onto a perspective setting. But they really are still volumetric. The little skirt on the back of both of them bends in its form as it goes around. There are arms, very cursorily indicated, but there are actual arms. This figure, whoever made this, and I believe it's Leonardo, was not content to just give us the front of a work. He had to give us the whole figure so that we could sense, and he could sense as he was making it, that it was actually present in front of us. Here's what, however, figures that are securely associated with Verrocchio look like. They are splendid. We've seen them in detail, but they have a front, and then there's a seam, as you can see on the left, and then there is cookie cutter stuff put on the back. It is just closed off, and in fact, some of them even are completely flattened, as though it helps to put them against the relief, but the artist is not particularly interested in reminding himself and, in the end, the viewer having the experience of a fully volumetric figure. The faces of these figures initially seem quite similar, and yet, as we begin to look at them, there are actually some differences. The taut, always sort of Clint Eastwood-looking sort of figure on the right-hand side that is so characteristic of Verrocchio is very different than the figure on the left-hand side, where this skin seems to be almost melting on the surface, where there is detail, where the skin is catching light in a pictorial fashion, where every detail is observed down to the point where this piece of fabric comes here, bends, and then is actually knotted, and then comes through the knot. This entire head, the size of a silver dollar. This is an artist who is even more observant than Verrocchio, who gives us a few lines here, but doesn't bother. He's the smarter one. Verrocchio's a lot smarter to give us the effect and not be obsessed with going the final detail. There are also other kinds of details that really do distinguish these. The tabbed fringe on the Verrocchio warrior, beautifully observed, neatly rendered with its little overlapping scallops, and perfectly satisfactory until we look at the one on the left. And those tabs, that fringe, it's actually some kind of substance that can bend and turn. It has fringe, it has holes, it is there, it is real. And it is very much like the kind of movement, the kind of action. This is very approximate, but there's no straight lines here. These are all moving. This you saw was moving. This was tied in a knot. This was in action. This relates to Leonardo. This, in fact, the Verrocchio, of course, is different. If we look at their further details, we begin to get some other clear indications that we have two very different artists at work here. Both of them are wearing these ancient style skirts. They both have repetitive patterns over them. But when you look at Verrocchio's, and I'll do this for you in just a moment, you find out he cheats. He cheats a lot. He starts here, and you notice there you've got these overlapping scallop forms, and you got 3, right? So if you got 3 layers, you'd expect that as this continuous thing goes across the skirt, you should get 3. Uh-oh. We got 2 there. We got 4 here. And you don't notice it, and it doesn't matter. He's just filling up the space. Leonardo, I would claim, on the other hand, never lets that kind of thing happen. And in fact, he's the kind of artist who even makes sure that the tiny belt buckles holding on his shin guards have little buckles, little tines, little holes, and that the belts themselves slightly bend in space. 2 different approaches, both of them splendidly visible, but that really distinguish them. The expression, the intensity of that expression as well. Pure Leonardo, a face at Windsor that is very similar, and I think perhaps for me the most telling comparison, this, when we look at the jowly figure of our warrior And this detail, I mean, I can't even imagine how many times I've enlarged it from what it really is, and we still are in the presence of an artist who has the ability to suggest to us that that skin is really there, that every little line on the lips are where they should be, that there is thought behind inside this person's head as well. Now, the young dancing boy was a little harder at first to distinguish between Verrocchio. He clearly comes out of a type like Verrocchio's David. He's a bit sweeter. He has that sort of Verrocchio-esque form. So, but I thought maybe he might be by Leonardo too for two reasons. One, we saw that these two figures, the dancing figure and the turbaned figure I just showed you, are the only two that have this three-dimensional complex form. They're the only figures who have some detail on the back, and they have exactly the same kind of decorative panel and pattern in their skirts, and no other figures do. So they come from the same person working out on the details. When we do a comparison, art historians always have to be careful about thinking about scale and size, because sometimes in photographs you can make things look really similar and it's so clear they all go together. But in this case, remember that the head we're talking about is the size of David's eye, and yet the head we're talking about in silver is actually more detailed than David. It is more full of visual information. It's the kind of thing that Leonardo would want to give us. It includes details such as these little stray hairs that appear under the nape of the neck, that also appear in many of Leonardo's portraits and paintings, where he wants to give you the sense of the layers and the observation of what might really be there. It's also the grace and just the general form, the tilt of that head, the poetics of this, so different than that very masculine style that dominates even Verrocchio's Madonnas and female figures. It's the way that these faces look, and when we see the figure on the left-hand side from the side, almost a view we don't normally get, we see that Leonardo has made sure that there's hair on both sides of the head. On the detail on the bottom right here, he does that same thing. He's always interested in volume, always interested in plasticity, always wants to make sure that the full figure is understood. He also makes sure that they're dancing, that they're complicated in their form. This is not, of course, the same subject by Leonardo on the right, but tilting the head, bending the arm, turning the waist, bending the leg back behind. All of that creates a figure that's in motion and that relates so well to Leonardo, down to details such as this. Tiny little hand, pinky holding the center of the platter, three fingers holding the rim, the thumb over the edge. So similar and so logically observed as in the Madonna on the right-hand side. Many artists in the Renaissance, this period, will make beautiful hands and the fingers are doing all kinds of things. But then you try to figure out, well, why is it doing that? Well, it's doing it because the artist thought it was pretty. Leonardo is able to combine beauty and function. He can make sure that he portrays something that will be both idealizing and therefore really aesthetically pleasing, and that we can sort out and understand its form. For all these reasons and some others, I believe that the two figures here are by Leonardo da Vinci, and that if there's something that we should imagine, what would a Leonardo sculpture look like? It's like this combination of intense observation, of beautiful rendering, of form that will give us an expressive range from the intense older male to the beautiful, almost feminine young boy on the right. And I want to leave you with a challenge, a job, as it were, because I've got some good news. There may still be two more Leonardo sculptures yet to discover. In the 1890s, a great German art historian, Wilhelm von Bode, reported that he saw clay terracotta models for the turban figure and for the dancing figure in a private collection in Paris. He said they were even more beautiful and more detailed than the silver works that he was able to see in Florence. They were in the collection of the widow of Alphonse Rothschild. They have disappeared since World War II. If you happen to find them, please give me a call. Thank you. This is a somewhat longer lecture than I normally give, but I am willing to entertain a few questions today.
So if anyone has one, I'll bring you the mic so that we can all hear. Everyone's convinced. Oh, here we go.
Hi, that was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I'm just curious what you think about the relationship between Leonardo and Bernini, a Baroque sculptor. And, you know, Bernini's always compared to Michelangelo and always is working in the shadow of Michelangelo, but he's quite different. And when you talk about Leonardo and his sculpture, I hear Bernini.
Thank you for that. I'm, you know, for me, the world ends after 1600. I love Bernini, but I hadn't put myself out there. And you've got the absolute right observation that perhaps one of the real values of having re-examined and looked at depth at Leonardo, the sculptor, is we can say, yeah, those ideals that we think are so original in Bernini, that you have to have it, the figure in motion, transition, all of these things.
Divine stone or sculpture itself, that it's not stone, it's not silver, it's real.
It's real. Yeah, I think that Bernini owes a lot to Leonardo's thinking, and he would have known these sorts of things because there were enough drawings, there was enough graphic evidence, and we know that there were some small models that were available in the period.
Well, it's honestly, it's a connection that I hadn't thought of because I never thought of Leonardo as a sculptor.
Exactly.
So
well,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Actually, the more I keep looking at this particular piece here, it keeps reminding me of a Hercules drawing by Leonardo.
Yes.
I think it's in Turin with the Nemean lion. And that has been sometimes associated with the pendant project for Michelangelo's David.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if you think if there's any
I
think, participation by
yes.
Leonardo.
You know, when you do an exhibition, you get as many pieces as you can. And one of the few pieces, actually, that's missing from this exhibition is either the Turin Hercules or a beautiful drawing of Hercules front and back that's in the Metropolitan Museum. And it just turns out that both those drawings were recently in exhibitions, one in Birmingham, one at the Met, and therefore were not available for loan. But as I've been reading the evidence, I'm increasingly convinced, yes, Leonardo, there's enough circumstantial evidence that Leonardo was imagining a Hercules sculpture that was going to stand in front of Palazzo Vecchio opposite the figure of David. And in fact, a Hercules eventually was commissioned from Baccio Bandinelli and stands there even today. So besides the competition that would have been upstairs in the Battle of Anghiari and the Battle of Cascina, two great battle paintings where the two artists showed different styles, we might have had Leonardo and Michelangelo facing it off right there in Piazza Signoria.
Here we go.
What do you think about the possibility that if you're a young guy and trying to prove yourself, you're going to do all the details, and as you become more experienced, you know what to leave in and what to leave out, and the difference between working for the master?
I think that's an interesting observation. I think Leonardo fights and wins that battle. That my sort of take on Leonardo is that the early works are there is almost too much detail in them, and that as he matures, he like Verrocchio has decided what not to put in. I know as a university professor, my hardest job is to decide what not to tell my students. And I think that's there. I'm not sure which direction you thought it was going, but I would say that I think that, yes, that there's more detail here, that it's more lifelike, is a sign that we've got the young artist who's coming out, and that my understanding, as I've seen what remains of Leonardo's work, is that later on he gets really savvy at distilling and making sure that you still get that effect, but that it all, in the end, becomes idealized, more general form. One more
Anyone
question,
else?
perhaps? Right next to you, Pat. Or
I've just recently decided that I'm going to change my major to art history, and I'm kind of like you. I feel like the world ends at 1600 because I've become so fascinated with the Renaissance. So I was kind of wondering if you had any pointers as to how to, because I would love to deal firsthand with stuff like this, and I was wondering if you had any pointers.
Well, you come to Syracuse University, right? No, what you do, I think, is you do what I've been fortunate to do, and that is to go and visit and see as many things as you can. Because like any kind of skill, it is the accumulation of observation. Don't ever think that because you've seen something, you've seen it. Revisit it. Look at it again. Come to this exhibition 5 times. Really make sure you're doing that. And just in whatever classes or whatever you're taking, read as much history and literature and other things as well as art, because this was a very connoisseurship-oriented class. Yes, students, you did very well. Lecture today. But what's really exciting about art history is that from visual evidence, we can make draw some conclusions that have a kind of validity that won't always be present in the written record. So taking those kinds of courses, making sure as well for all of us, work on our writing, because we have to express in words what others have expressed in form. And I'm still a student in that myself, but I'm enjoying using my words, and I thank you for allowing me to do them today. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn.